Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's seminar, The Psychology of Possession States. My name is Tu Fong Li. Let's get started. So let's begin with a question that sits at the center of this entire discussion. What does it mean to no longer feel fully in control of your own mind or body? Now, for some, that experience is described as dissociation. For others, it is possession. And in many indigenous traditions, it may be understood as a form of communication, an opening or an in between. Others also call it mediumship. So, this seminar is not interested in collapsing these into one explanation. And instead, I want us to hold multiple frameworks at once, and multiple experiences can be true at one time. So we're going to explore possession as a human experience that can be interpreted through psychology, spirituality, and culture, and each offering different truths, different risks, different experiences, and different forms of meaning. So before we go any further, it's important to slow down and define these terms because language is doing a lot of work here. In Western and especially in Christian context, possession typically implies that there is an external entity entering and overtaking the body. And there is an assumption of invasion, a loss of control, and often danger. When we look at this from a psychological standpoint, we throw around the term dissociation a lot. And dissociation refers to a disruption in consciousness, in our identity, memory, or perception. And this is not inherently, pathological. It becomes clinical depending on the severity, the distress, and the impairment of the disorder. Now, we have the term that we use, and we call it mediumship or trance. And mediumship or trance is a term that is commonly used in indigenous and spiritual traditions. And these often describe an intentional altered state where a person may serve as a bridge between worlds. They're in the in between. So already we have three different types of divisions or three different types of experiences. Is it an invasion? Is it a fragmentation, according to psychology, or is it a form of communication, as referred to in mediumship and in trance? Now, from a psychological perspective, many possession like experiences can be understood through the lens of dissociation. And dissociation exists on a spectrum, right? On the mild end, it's something that we all experience. We're spacing out, we're losing track of time. On the opposite side of that, the more severe end, it can involve a fragmentation of identity, of memory, and of agency. So, where we can forget those things or we can recreate a whole new experience of identity, of memory, and our perception. One of the most well known conditions associated with this is called dissociative identity disorder or DID. And this involves the presence of distinct identity states, often emerging as adaptations to trauma. But it's critical to be precise here because not all possession experiences are dissociative identity disorder, and most are not. So, what psychology can explain are the mechanisms, right? The mind's ability to organize, or the influence of belief and expectations, or the way that distress can be expressed through culturally available narratives. That is what psychology can explain. Now, one of the most powerful forces shaping possession is belief. If a person lives in a cultural or religious system where possession is understood as real, then distress, fear, or altered states may take that form. And this doesn't mean that the person is faking it. It means that the experience is real for them and it is being organized through a cultural script. For example, in one context, someone may say, I feel like I'm not myself. In another experience, they may say something like, something has taken over me. And these two very mutual experiences are seen across possessive cases, right? It's the same underlying experience, but different interpretation. And once that interpretation is named, it becomes reinforced by our family, by our community, our upbringing, medical and or religious authority. So possession is not just an internal experience, it is also something that is socially co-constructed. This is where we need to be especially mindful not to impose the Western frameworks onto indigenous practices. So, in many indigenous traditions, what might be labeled as possession from the outside is not understood as invasion or pathology. And instead, it is often a form of spiritual communication. So, shamans, healers, mediums, or spiritual practitioners, they may enter altered states intentionally or be willing to or are susceptible to it to use their body as vessels. They may allow spirits, ancestors, or other entities to speak through them, not as a loss of the self, but as a role that they are trained to embody. And this is a very common experience for many shamans and psychics or mediums. And this is not random. It is a structured and disciplined and culturally validated form of spiritual practice. So the shaman is not seen as overtaken, but they are seen as mediators, someone who can move and communicate between the worlds. And so, importantly, these states are often learned over time, sometimes through an illness, through visions, or what might initially appear as distress. So, what one system might diagnose as dissociation in the Western world, another may recognize it as a calling in indigenous cultures. Here's a distinction that becomes really important, and it's that not all possession states are experienced the same way. Some are invited, right? And that is through ritual, that is through training or through intention. Others are imposed, so they may be unexpected, distressing, and often frightening. But even this is not a clean binary. A person may begin with uncontrolled experiences and later learn to regulate them within a cultural framework. Or it can be an experience that feels imposed, may later be reinterpreted as something that is meaningful or divine or sacred, right? So rather than thinking in categories, it's important to think in spectrums of control and meaning in the context of the possessed state. Now, we also need to address an important question that often comes up, and that is possession real or is it performed? The answer is more complicated than either of those options, right? Because some possession states are clearly performed and in the sense that they are shaped by our perceptions, our understanding, our expectations, rituals, and our audience. But performance does not necessarily mean that they are false. Other experiences are deeply felt and embodied, where individuals report a genuine loss or a transformation of control within the self. So, what matters here is that the subjective experience can be real, even if interpretations differ. So, instead of asking whether it is real, it's important to ask what is happening psychologically, what is happening culturally, and what does this experience do for the individual and their family. And so this is where we might want to tighten up our analysis, right? Because while dissociative identity disorder is often used to explain possession, the overlap is somewhat limited. So dissociative identity disorder identities are typically internally generated. They are consistent over time. And the distinction is that they are closely tied to trauma. It says that because something so traumatic happened to the individual, that their mind protects them by taking on a different perspective. In possession states, on the other hand, they are often attributed to an external entity. They are episodic or situational. So this means that they may be triggered by something, or the possessive state happens in episodes. They are also shaped by our cultural and religious expectations. So while dissociation in the Western and psychological sense helps to explain the mechanisms, right, the symptoms of what happens in the brain, it does not fully explain the form or the shape of the possession. And so that distinction is critical for both in scholarship and in practice. So at this point, we can shift from theory into observable patterns. So, what are often described as the symptoms of possession? The first thing to emphasize here is that there is no universal diagnostic standard for possession. What counts as a sign in one tradition may not even register in another, right? And I'll use this example in that if there's an isolated indigenous tribe in Africa, they may not see possession as this psychological dissociative mental disorder, right? Instead, what we see are clusters of behaviors and experiences that are interpreted through cultural and religious frameworks. So many of these overlap significantly with psychiatric and neurological conditions. So again, rather than asking what are the symptoms of possession as it were a clinical entity, but a more inclusive and accurate question is what patterns of experience tend to be labeled as possession across the context? That's a more inclusive question when we're looking at the possession states. So let's take a moment to look at some of these symptoms of possessions. Across documented cases, particularly in Christian exorcism traditions and some global case studies, we see reoccurring behavioral and physical patterns when it comes to possessions, right? These include changes in voice, sometimes described as deeper, multiple, or unfamiliar. There may be sudden and dramatic personality shifts in the person, where we see the individual appearing unlike themselves. These also include speaking in a completely different language, often an outdated or ancient language. Um, some cases report intense agitation or what is perceived as unusual strength in the person. Others include convulsions or trance-like immobility, where the body is going through this very intense seizure-like or epileptic trance. So in certain religious contexts, there is also reported aversion to sacred objects, to prayers, or to spaces. So things like crosses, Bibles, amulets, chants, and charms, there is an agitation response when presented to a person who appears to be possessed. Now, from a clinical standpoint, many of these signs map onto known conditions, and these include seizure disorders, epilepsy, acute stress response, and dissociative episodes. From the subjective perspective, right, individuals often report a profound sense of loss of control. And they often describe it as if their thoughts or their speech or their actions are no longer their own. And this is perhaps the most commonly reported experience of possession. People will say, that wasn't me, or that something entered their body. There may be auditory experiences, such as hearing voices or a strong internal dialogue that feels externalized. And many saints in Christianity, as an example, report auditory possessions, right? Some of them report receiving messages and visuals from angels or from the Virgin Mary. And so memory gaps are also a very common reported experience in which the episodes are a period of time that the person that is experiencing the possession cannot often recall what happens during that time period. Some describe identity confusion or feeling like someone else is present within them, right? Some report that these experiences are dreamlike, and some report it as seeing themselves being possessed but not having autonomy or control over what they do or what they say anymore. Psychologically, these map closely onto dissociation, to a trauma response, and in some cases, psychotic spectrum experiences, or what we call as a major and intense mental breakdown. They are stress and trauma induced. But again, the interesting distinction is this, and it's that the same internal experience can be interpreted as psychological fragmentations or spiritual intrusion, right? Depending on the framework. One of the most significant findings within anthropology, within transcultural psychiatry or psychology of religion, is that possession states are not random or universally expressed in the same way. Instead, possession experiences tend to follow what scholars sometimes call cultural scripts. So, a cultural script is essentially a social shared framework that teaches individuals what possession looks like. It teaches people how it behaves, what entities are believed to do it, and how others are expected to respond to possession. So, this means that symptoms are not occurring in a vacuum, but they are shaped by our collective belief systems, our perceptions of religious narratives, our ritual expectations, and community reinforcement, right? So, for example, in many Christian exorcism traditions, um, possession may involve an aversion to a sacred object, right? You present a cross to a possessed person and they respond to that. Possession may involve blasphemous speech, violent bodily reactions during prayer, or claims of demonic intrusion, or speaking in ancient tongues, right? So these symptoms mirror theological assumptions about demons as oppositional and corruptive forces. In contrast, within many indigenous and shamanic traditions, including monk shamanism, these altered states of possession may involve rhythmic movements, they may involve entering trance through induced ritual, they may involve spirit communication, temporary embodiment of ancestors, or spiritual entities. So, importantly, these experiences are not always interpreted as pathological or evil. In many cases, they are considered socially valuable and spiritually necessary. Now, many anthropologists have long argued that possession states are learned and reinforced through ritual participation and communal expectations. So, what does that even mean? It means that individuals observe how possession is expressed within their culture, and these patterns become embodied over time. Now, this does not mean that the experience of possession is fabricated. Rather, it suggests that human consciousness is deeply responsive to symbolic systems and social environments. So we can only experience the limitations of what our mind and consciousness are able to do. Now, one of the most important developments in modern psychiatry is that the DSM 5 does not completely dismiss possession experiences. Instead, the DSM 5 reframes them within a clinical framework known as possession form dissociation, or PFD. And possession form dissociation appears under dissociative disorders, and it refers to experiences where a person feels as though their identity has shifted, their agency has been disrupted, or an outside force has taken control of thoughts, speech, emotions, or behavior. So, what is particularly important here is that psychiatry itself recognizes that these experiences globally, right, can occur in ways that feel profoundly real to the individual. However, the DSM 5 introduces an important distinction between culturally normative spiritual practices and clinically significant dysfunction. So, for example, if a person enters a trance during a culturally accepted ritual practice, such as a shamanic ritual, this is not automatically considered pathological. Now, why, right? Because psychiatry increasingly acknowledges that altered states of consciousness are not universal signs of mental illness. And instead, clinicians are instructed to evaluate several dimensions. And these dimensions include: does this possessive experience cause distress? Does it impair daily functioning to the person? Does it create risk or instability to the person? And critically, is it outside the norms of the individual's cultural or religious context? Right? So, this last point represents a major shift from earlier psychiatric models that often demonizes non Western spiritual experiences. And historically, many indigenous and religious practices were dismissed as superstition, hysteria, or primitive psychology. And what we call as contemporary transcultural psychiatry, it attempts to move beyond that framework to something that is more inclusive and incorporates culture into mental health. So many experiences labeled as possession overlap significantly with recognized psychiatric, neurological, or physiological phenomena. However, overlap does not mean equivalence, right? The same symptom can emerge from very different mechanisms and carry very different meanings depending on the context. So, for example, hearing voices may occur in psychotic disorders. Trauma related dissociation Grief experiences, spiritual practices, or sleep related states may all experience some type of auditory disturbance. Another example is bodily shaking, right? It may occur during panic, it may occur during seizures, epilepsies, but it also occurs during a ritual trance or an emotionally heightened religious experience. So feelings of external control may emerge in psychosis, dissociation, coercive social environments, or culturally reinforced spiritual interpretations. So, this is why possession cannot be approached simplistically or in a straight line approach. It's important for a clinician uh, to not ethically assume demonic influence in the same way they cannot assume that the person um, is experiencing a dissociative disorder, right? Instead, the task becomes phenomenon based, meaning what exactly is the individual experiencing? How do they interpret that experience? And how does their cultural environment shape that interpretation to them? And so this is especially important because possession experiences are often socially reinforced. So religious communities, spiritual communities may interpret symptoms as evidence of spiritual warfare, and families may unintentionally strengthen possession narratives through fear, through attention, or ritual responses. In the same way, clinicians may over diagnose culturally normative spiritual experiences due to their unfamiliarity with indigenous or religious frameworks. So the challenge is not choosing one explanation, but navigating multiple possibilities responsibly. So rather than asking whether these experiences are objectively supernatural or purely psychological, we have to ask, and myself included as a doctoral scholar, right? We have to ask, what does this experience feel like to the person that is living through it? And so, across possession narratives, individuals frequently report intense auditory, visual, bodily, and perceptual phenomenon. And we'll go through some of these in the next few slides. One of the most common experiences involves hearing voices. And these voices may command, they may accuse, threaten, mock, or claim identity as a spirit, a demon, or a higher form of entity. And so, importantly, these voices are often experienced not as internal thoughts, but as externally originating presences. Others report seeing shadow figures, they report seeing faces, they report seeing human like entities, alien or reptilian like entities, distorted bodies, right? Religious imagery. So some people may see the crucifixion of Christ, they may see the Virgin Mary, right? Or they may also see threatening presences of entities at the edge of their perception. So some describe a powerful sensation that something is in the room, right? Even when nothing visible appears to others in the room. And this phenomenon, the sensed presence, is remarkably common across possession accounts. It is also very common, however, in trauma experiences. It is also very common among extreme stress, stress induced, sleep paralysis, some neurological conditions, and even certain meditative or altered states of consciousness, right? So, what becomes important when looking at this from a psychological catalog is to analyze how the brain constructs agency, how fear alters our perception, and how culture gives shape and identity to ambiguous experiences. So let's dig a little deeper onto some of these shared experiences. And we begin this with auditory experiences. So these auditory experiences are among the most psychologically significant aspects of possession states. So many individuals who report experiencing possession report hearing voices that feel autonomous and external, meaning it's not coming from the inside, but something external is telling them something or creating the auditory experience. For example, in Christian possession narratives, these voices are often interpreted as demonic. Now, in other spiritual traditions, they may be understood as ancestors, as spirits, or as guiding entities. When we look at this from a psychological standpoint, however, there are several mechanisms that may contribute to these experiences. So, one explanation involves, again, dissociation and fragmented self states. So, thoughts, emotions, or memories that are psychologically organized in our mind may be experienced as coming from someone else. That's the dissociation in psychology. Trauma researchers have also noted that dissociation can disrupt the normal integration of consciousness, leading internal material to feel externalized. And another explanation comes from the psychotic spectrum experiences, where auditory hallucinations may emerge through altered perception and cognitive processing. But most importantly, not all voice hearing, not all auditory experiences are pathological. When we look at research in transcultural psychiatry, this has shown that the meaning of voices, the emotional tone of voices, and the relationship that the individual has with the voices varies dramatically across cultures. And that's what makes it challenging, and it also makes it very unique. So, in some contexts, voices are terrifying. In others, they may be interpreted as something that is divine, as something that is protective. In Christianity, for example, there's historical records of saints that have received auditory messages from angels, right? Other folks may receive auditory messages from demons. So again, culture shapes not only our interpretation, but the experience itself. And then we move into visual experiences. So visual experiences are associated with possession states, and they are equally important to analyze. Many individuals who experience possession describe seeing shadow-like figures. They describe seeing human or non-human entities, distorted faces, religious symbols, or movement in peripheral vision. So when we look at the neuroscience and the psychology of it, visual experiences during possession suggest that heightened fear and hypervigilance dramatically alter perception. When the brain is under stress, uncertain sensory input may be interpreted as threatening, and ambiguous stimulus becomes meaningful. And so this helps explain why people in highly charged religious or spiritual settings may visually interpret their experiences through spiritual frameworks that are already present in the environment, right? From a neurological and psychological standpoint, When we look at things like sleep deprivation, fasting, when we look at things like intense prayer or sensory deprivation and emotional overload, all common in some ritual context. And these things can also increase our perceptual distortions and visionary experiences, right? If a person is undergoing an intense an emotional prayer session, that can distort their visual experiences in that episode. But here is the critical point. The emotional reality of these experiences is often very profound, regardless of their origin and regardless of whether we as people believe in it or not. So people are not merely imagining abstract concepts. They are experiencing fear, presence, imagery, and the embodiment in deeply uh, important and critical ways that make sense and have meaning for them. And so, because these experiences feel real, they shape identity, they shape belief, they shape memory and behavior in lasting ways. So at this point, we move into one of the most historically influential frameworks within demonology and exorcism traditions, the so called stages of possession. And we're going to explore four important stages of possessions. And these stages appear most prominently in Christian literature, especially in Catholic exorcism traditions and contemporary deliverance ministries. These stages are theological and interpretive constructs, so there is no empirical psychiatric model or theory that confirms this as a universal progression from temptation to now full possession. But by studying these stages, we're also studying the psychology of belief. We're studying the psychology of interpretation and memory. So the first stage of possession is often described as infestation or oppression. In demonological traditions, or in demonology, this first stage often involves external disturbances rather than direct control of the individual. And so people in this stage may report like they're feeling watched. They may report disturbing dreams, unexplained noises around the house, right? They may report sudden fear or a persistent sense of heaviness or darkness. Psychologically, many of these experiences correlate with heightened anxiety and hypervigilance, or they start to feel paranoid. So, when individuals are under chronic stress or fear, the nervous system becomes increasingly threat oriented, right? Paranoid and vigilant. And so ambiguous sensory experiences begin to feel charged, and we begin to give meaning to that. Sleep disruption is also particularly important in stage one and is often a good indicator of an infestation or oppression. So, sleep paralysis and what we call as hypnagogic hallucinations and fragmented sleep can produce sensations of presence, right? They can produce pressure in the chest, sleep paralysis, right? And they can also produce shadow like figures and auditory experiences. So many people who experience sleep paralysis report unusual auditory experiences. They report screaming, they report radio noises, they report hearing voices in a language that they've never heard before. So what's important to note in this stage is that the infestation, the oppression, and these symptoms in this stage is not a one-time occurrence. So just because you experience sleep paralysis one time, it doesn't mean that now you are in the infestation stage, right? Stage one is typically a phase that intensifies and it is consistent over time. And that moves into stage two. So stage two is often referred to as the obsession stage. At this point, the struggle becomes more internalized, and individuals may report persistent intrusive thoughts, violent or blasphemous mental imagery. So they may be thinking constantly about killing somebody, right? Constant fear of contamination or corruption, or a preoccupation with demonic influence. So suddenly, if a person has interest in demonology, or they become obsessed with a certain demon, right? A person may interpret ordinary intrusive thoughts as evidence of spiritual compromise. And this kind of creates a feedback loop because fear increases our monitoring increases intrusive awareness, and then intrusive awareness reinforces our fear, right? It's the feedback loop. And so, from a psychological standpoint, this closely resembles obsessive rumination and anxiety spectrum processes. Religious scripture is especially relevant here because this involves obsessive fear surrounding sin, surrounding morality, or spiritual failure. What makes this stage particularly powerful is that individuals begin interpreting internal psychological conflicts as external spiritual attacks. Some of them may be aware of the obsession, and some of them may not be aware. So the mind's own distress becomes personified. And then we move into stage three. So in the third stage, sometimes called the oppression or the influence stage, the person may begin experiencing deeper disruptions in identity, in emotion, and in agency. So reports may include things like feeling emotionally unlike oneself. That is very common for people in this stage where they report feeling like they no longer feel like themselves or they feel like a completely different person. Friends and family around that person may not even recognize that person anymore, right? Sudden shifts or mood changes or behavior changes. Episodes of dissociation, so they may have a sudden change in who they are, right? Periods of memory loss. So if during the episode they don't recall anything that happened, or they may also enter trance-like states where they become possessed. So within spiritual frameworks, these experiences are often interpreted as increasing demonic influence or spiritual influence. From a psychological standpoint, stage three aligns closely with dissociative processes, not the disorder yet, but just the process of it. So when identity becomes destabilized under stress or under trauma, we may experience depersonalization, right? We withdraw from reality. We become cold. There's no emotion. We may report feelings and thoughts and behaviors that are no longer fully self-generated. And importantly, religious communities may begin identifying the person as spiritually afflicted, which further shapes the individual's self-understanding and behavioral expression. In this sense, possession becomes relational. It is not merely an experience that is internal, but socially recognized by others. It is during stage 3 that close family and friends will say that the person no longer, they don't recognize the person, or the person has changed so much, right? And stage 4 is the full possession stage. Now, this is characterized by an apparent displacement of the self, where people may speak in different voices. They may claim alternate identities. They may experience amnesia afterwards, or they don't remember anything, or they display dramatic behavioral changes, right? One moment the person is normal, and within a split of a second, they are triggered and they become a whole different person. They start saying different things, right? Within religious frameworks, this is interpreted as a direct demonic control. In Indigenous perspective, this is considered a possession episode. From a psychological perspective, there are several interpretations that emerge. There is severe dissociative states, right? There is trauma-related fragmentation, stress-induced. There is psychotic processes, and there is extreme suggestibility within ritual environments, or culturally structured altered states of consciousness. What we mean by suggestibility is that if a person comes from a very religious and conservative household, they may take on, or they may be more suggestible, susceptible even, to perform possession. So what becomes important here is the embodiment. So the body becomes the stage upon which psychological, social, and spiritual conflict is expressed. And because these states occur within highly charged ritual settings, they often become amplified through um, an audience, right? So who's around us, our family and friends, their expectations, the religious symbolism that we have been or are exposed to, the emotional contagion, and the authority structures that surround us. One of the most important dimensions of possession narratives, that is both psychological and spiritual, is the escalation. So across many demonology traditions and studies, possession is rarely described as an instantaneous, right? People don't become suddenly possessed and they are immediately gone after that, right? Instead, what is common in almost all possession cases, regardless of culture, regardless of belief, is that it unfolds progressively. It is a progressive escalation. So, whether interpreted spiritually or psychologically, there is often a noticeable movement from an external disturbance to an internal destabilization of the person to now fragmentation of agency and identity. So, what becomes increasingly apparent through each stage of possession is the gradual erosion of the individual's sense of self, right? So, for example, in stage 1, the individual is still largely themselves, and they still have autonomy from themselves, separate from the possession phenomenon. But they start to experience fear and anxiety and disturbing dreams and sleep disturbances or sensations. They start to get a sense of an external presence. But the person still retains a stable sense of identity and control. Um, in stage 2, for example, right? the experience then moves and becomes more internalized. So intrusive thoughts increase. Fear here in stage 2 becomes chronic. The person or the individual then begins monitoring themselves constantly. Um, they start to look for signs of corruption or an attack. In stage 2, people often feel like there's something off. They feel like something is happening externally, um, or internally within themselves. So this creates a dangerous feedback loop. Again, our fear increases our intention. Our attention to this intensifies our symptoms. Our symptoms reinforce our belief that we are possessed or that there's something wrong. And that belief, again, further amplifies fear. It's a loop that just goes in a circle. And over time, that person may begin reorganizing their identity around the possessed narrative itself. By stage 3, the escalation often becomes more pronounced. So people may feel emotionally disconnected. They may feel totally unlike themselves or unable to fully regulate their thoughts and behaviors. They have outbursts. They no longer recognize themselves. They stop doing or engaging in activities that bring them joy. And so the boundary between self and perceived external influence becomes increasingly unstable. So at this point in stage 3, relationships, routines, and reality may begin deteriorating. The individual may withdraw socially and become increasingly dependent on religious authority, on rituals, on interpretive systems, right? Um, this is a stage where people um, they withdraw themselves from work, they withdraw themselves from friends and family, right? And they begin to isolate themselves. The escalation then moves into stage 4. So by this stage, the person may experience what feels like a complete collapse of agency and autonomy. They no longer have control during a possession episode. So, whether understood spiritually as full possession or psychologically as a severe dissociative enactment, the person during stage 4 may no longer experience themselves as fully in control. The self then becomes displaced by another perceived identity, a force, or an entity. So the possession progression, right, the escalation, functions similarly to how we think about progressive illness processes, right? For example, cancer. So in medicine, right, early detection of cancer matters because intervention before it systematically spreads often leads to better outcomes and less invasive treatments. Similarly, the same for possession as well, right? The earlier we can intervene in stage 1 or stage 2, the less severe the outcome may become. So, at its deepest level, possession is fundamentally a crisis of selfhood. Regardless of whether one person interprets possession spiritually or psychologically, the central issue is the destabilization of identity and control. So the person no longer experiences themselves as coherent or fully directed by themselves, right? The person's thoughts may feel foreign, the emotions may feel intrusive, and the behaviors may feel authored by something outside of themselves. And so psychologically, this reflects fragmentation and dissociation. When we look at this from a spiritual and religious framework, it may be interpreted as an invasion or a complete uh, influence. But in every framework, possession confronts one of the most fundamental assumptions of human consciousness, and that is that the self is singular. That is, that we are stable and we should be fully autonomous. Possession comes in and destabilizes that about ourselves, that about human beings. And in doing so, it forces us to confront a very uncomfortable question about our consciousness and about humans themselves, right? So, how unified, how deep independent are we as human beings, really, right? How much of our identity is socially constructed? How vulnerable is human perception to fear, to belief, to trauma, and to ritual? So, in many ways, possession states reveal not only cultural beliefs about spirits, but the fragility of human identity itself. So, possession narratives also reveal to us something profound about societies. And demons and possessing entities often embody our collective fears. They often embody moral corruption, sexual deviance. Possession entities embody illnesses, loss of control, violence, and social instability. And so it becomes a social language for explaining behaviors or identities that communities find threatening, disruptive. And in this sense, demonology functions both psychologically and, yes, politically as well. It externalizes fear, it personifies suffering, and it creates a narrative through which communities organize morality and control, right? The demon itself becomes symbolic. So, to conclude our seminar, possession states cannot be fully understood through a single discipline. And psychology alone cannot explain the cultural specificity of possession. In the same way that theology and religion and spirituality alone cannot explain the pathology of possession. Possession exists at the very intersections of our mind, our body, our culture, the trauma that we carry and experience and cope with, the spiritual rituals, the religious symbology that we believe in, and perhaps most importantly, possession reveals humanity's ongoing struggle to explain experiences that feel larger than the self. The psychology of possession states ultimately reveal less about demons alone and more about the human need to create meaning around our suffering, fragments of our experiences, fear, and the unknown. So, thank you so much for joining me in this 1 hour seminar. And until next time.